Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kelly with Wisconsin Land and Water, and before we begin, I just have a couple of announcements. So first, this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted to the Wisconsin Land and Water website in the very near future. You'll be receiving a follow-up email after today's webinar with an evaluation survey, as well as a link to this recording, and then any other materials that today's presenters wish to pass along. During today's webinar, please feel free to submit any questions you have either in the chat function or using the Q&A feature. I'll be keeping an eye on both, so you can submit your questions throughout the presentations today, but we will probably be saving addressing them until the very end of the presentations today at the end of the webinar, just so that we can make sure that we can get through all of the material. I will also throw up, let me start a new share here. Our sponsors today. Give them a thank you. And I also just wanted to mention real quick, so during our webinar registration, the form that we had contained 4 questions to gauge your interest and your experience, and the answers to these questions kind of helped to inform our presenters in designing today's presentations. So we wanted to share the answers that we received to give you all an idea of the crowd that is attending this webinar live. So our first question was, what is your experience level in assessing wetland and stream function? The majority of you identified yourselves moderately experienced, though there was still about a quarter of participants today falling into either advanced or minimal. The second question was about what interested you most in this webinar. And the majority of you indicated that you're interested in learning about design and construction, but there was clear interest in each of the choices outlined. We asked what type of restoration you typically work on, and don't be fooled by the fact that these bars make it look split. You can see the results were well within 87 to 96 responses for each answer. For this question, you weren't limited to choosing only one of these categories. So overall, there was nearly equal distribution in terms of your work in streams versus wetlands and on public versus private land. And our last question was, what best describes your focus of work? And over 2/3 of you indicated either a biological or physical chemical focus, but there were 16.8% that would describe your focus in outreach and education, and 11.3% whose focus is in land use planning. I'll throw this up here again, our sponsors today, but we do want to jump right into things. So our first speaker today is Fred Fassler. Fred was raised on a dairy farm near Brodhead, Wisconsin. He worked for Applied Ecological Services at Brodhead for 27 years and learned about native ecosystems and restoration from a wide variety of coworkers. He spent the last 15 years overseeing seed production of 125 species. Fred has been a member of the Prairie Enthusiasts for 36 years and has been the site steward for Briggs Wetland since 2016. So Fred is here today to give the site background for Briggs Wetland. And Fred, I will pass things over to you.
Thank you. As they said, with the Prairie Enthusiasts who owns Briggs Wetland, it's a relatively high quality wetland. Total parcel is about 24 acres. It's located northwest of Beloit, about 4 miles. This property was purchased by the Prairie Enthusiasts in 1994. The reorganized Church of Latter-day Saints, which is actually an offshoot of the main Mormon church, had owned the property since the 1970s because it had historical value to them. One of their founding members was Jason Briggs, who lived on the farm across the road. And in 1851, while debating if he should stay with the Mormon church or separate and help form a separate church, he had a revelation, and so that's been kind of a special location for him. As far as management, we've been burning it every 6 years or so. More so in the last 10 years, we've been a little more aggressive about going after buckthorn and honeysuckle. We've been able to get access to the west edge of the property, which is along the east branch of the Raccoon Creek, which where most of the invasives were. We also had buckthorn growing along the ditch that connects the spring. The spring and ditch, which is the main focus of this program. Also, when we purchased the property, I also want to mention the Natural Land Institute, Rockford, Illinois, was able to purchase the property and hold it. It took us about 2 years to come up with the funding because back in the 90s, we were still a pretty small chapter. 2019 Green Rock Audubon, which I'm also a member of, purchased land to the north, which actually gave us access. And that land also includes or extends a high quality wetland and has additional springs, high quality springs that are feeding the wetland and the creek. About 20 years ago, the DNR also reintroduced brook trout to the Raccoon Creek. So it is a high quality area, and it's kind of fun learning about it as I work on it. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. So speaking next today, our first presentation is by Dr. Faith Fitzpatrick. Dr. Faith Fitzpatrick is a research hydrologist at the U.S. Geological Survey Upper Midwest Water Science Center in Madison, Wisconsin. Over her 30-plus-year career, she has worked on applied research related to fluvial geomorphology that includes topics of watershed sediment sources and sinks, natural and human causes for geomorphic change, river geomorphic assessments, and rehabilitation evaluation. She joins us today to present on geomorphology and groundwater interactions.
Hi, Kelly. So I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. And then start my presentation. Okay, it looks like it's sharing the screen, and then I'm going to go into presentation mode. Hopefully. Okay. Does that look okay on your guys' end? Or is it showing the right screen?
Looks good.
Looks good. Okay. So I just start out, I don't have familiarity with Briggs Wetland in particular. I'm going to give an overview of, and as Kelly mentioned, I'm a geomorphologist. So I'm going to give an overview of headwater wetland type streams and kind of the geomorphology and the groundwater interactions that go along with those. So they're kind of special streams that Wisconsin has. So I'll go over some of the characteristics of those. And I have like too many slides for the 20 minutes that I have. I'm hoping they kind of serve as a background, and maybe they will help later as the discussion, or if you have questions that come up later too with the other presentations. So just kind of some statements. So this is like the conclusions up front for these, I guess you could say. In Wisconsin, we have a lot of groundwater rich systems, and they cross many different landform types and geologic settings. And these groundwater fed headwater streams are usually surrounded by wetlands. You can see that many of them have been ditched or straightened, drainage extension into the wetlands, road runoff added to those. And that's pretty much statewide, but even more so in southern Wisconsin, where you're in more of the ag areas. There's an interplay, like what we see with the stream characteristics, is a reflection of both like longitudinally and laterally what's going on. And biology is really important in these, as well as the hydrology and then that physical setting. And so the geomorphology, and this is a really basic thing, but it's super important for these. It's geomorphology, as we kind of see a lot of it in channel form and plan form, is driven by runoff characteristics. But in this case, the channels, when there's spring fed, reflect the base flow, and they also reflect the vegetation around them. And in some cases, if you have beaver, they reflect the beaver activity as one of the largest biologic geomorphic agents. And so these channels, they might be multi-channel, depending on how the springs are coming in. They're anastomosing, so I'll kind of go through some of these terms. They might be highly variable in how they meander, and if they are single thread, how that looks, and how wide they are and such, because they're kind of driven by that spring relation. Yeah, it's just a map overall. The US, this is a base flow index, so this kind of gives some indication of where those groundwater fed streams are located. And you can see what Wisconsin and the west side of Michigan are really hot spots for these groundwater fed streams. And you can see they go across the driftless area, which is much different than the eastern part of the state. And then the diagram on the right is just reminding us of that flood hydrograph and the runoff, the overland component of it. So when we think of channel size, it's driven, by that runoff component usually. But we really got to remember that base flow component is the important in these groundwater headwater streams. And then if we zoom into Wisconsin in particular, they're highly related. These streams that have high base flow index, so that's that flow that's there between the rain events, are related to the cold water trout streams that we have. And you can kind of see their distribution is related to the, again, the geology of the state. They're very much related to what the stratigraphy, as well as the landforms are in that connection. So that map on the bottom, that diagram is kind of showing you have some streams that go across end moraines, some that are in outwash areas, and so you have both the landform and the topography and layering that goes on that gives you this distribution, and not an even distribution of how the base flow comes in, and which streams. You might have streams right next to each other where one has groundwater component or springs and the other one doesn't, depending on what that setup is with the geology. Just in general too, groundwater, is important. Groundwater is tied to streams by the water table. And that's just kind of a general groundwater surface water interactions slide. And again, emphasizing that water that we see in the channel is very much related to the water table around it. And in some cases, you might have a dry channel where it's losing water. The water table is below the stream bottom level, and it's going into a permeable layer and recharging an aquifer that way. And that water table changes, depending on the type of precipitation, annual precipitation that we have. Wet years versus dry years, that can also be reduced depending if you have groundwater pumping, like with a municipal drinking water supply. And so that can really vary, like where you see that water connect with the channel. And springs can be very sensitive to that because they're in that very close relationship with what the water table is. And depending on what their sources are. Again, it's kind of like, these are all just kind of really basic slides, but a lot of times we don't see this. We just kind of think of streams as like relating to flood flow. So we kind of emphasize that we have, when we talk about streams and alluvium, that and we're in a setting like Wisconsin where we have a water table that it's called the hyporheic zone if it's really close to the stream bottom or the stream. Sometimes we even like talk about the hyporheic zone being like across a riffle, and the fish kind of know where that's happening too, and where they do spawning, and it keeps the gravels clean to some extent, and it can be across the inside of meander bends. Just kind of looking at a little bit more of like, on the left side there is kind of a general groundwater flow path. with kind of uniform material where you have the groundwater seeping into and interconnecting with that stream, or it might be a lake shoreline. And then on the right there is where you have some different kinds of deposits. Some are more permeable than others. And when you get something that's less permeable over top of a permeable layer, that's when you have the topography there that's kind of feeding and getting into that permeable layer. That's where you get a spring. And it kind of shows those sand units might be something that discharge a spring, or sometimes it's one of the sandstone units, or like some of the fractured dolomite that's next to the sandstone units. It's kind of what we have around in Madison. Okay, yeah, so you kind of get to see these when you're out there, right? You kind of have here's different creeks that we have looked at, and so you'll have these little inlets coming in. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not. So very discontinuous banks. A lot of times there'll be a muck of where these come out to. Here's one out. I won't run the video for the sake of time, but you see the bubbling bottom where the sand is boiling up. Here's a forested setting. You can see all these little inlets. So it's very connected setting here, low floodplain. A lot of times you have the tufted grass, which I'm with the hummocks. I'm not going to get into species on that, where the hummocks are above the water, but in between it's just all wet, right? So it's kind of less defined banks in those situations, depending on how that's feeding in. You know, I put through this slide, and it's hard to find streams that aren't altered. And this is one example from northern Wisconsin, up in the middle of nowhere in the Bayfield Peninsula, for example. And these two streams are next to each other. The one on the left is spring fed. You can hardly see it. That's a trout stream. This is like just upstream of their confluence. The one on the right, that one had log drives in it. You know, we had log drives which helped to kind of clean out a lot of the streams in the North Woods. But that still exists today. So you can see how much higher the banks are with the one on the right. And then when we look at the cross sections too, the cross section on the right, for the one that had the log drives and has been cleared, you see it's got a much bigger channel morphology, much deeper. So different than the one on the left, with the more connected spring-fed groundwater-driven channel. And you can see the difference in base flow there. They have both about the same drainage area. One's got about 14 cubic feet per second, whereas the one on the right's got 2 cubic feet per second. It's a lot more groundwater coming out of that cranberry one. And you know, it's not that one was log drived and one wasn't. They couldn't get into this one to do the log drives because it was so swampy, right? It's a cedar swamp. But it also, you know, kind of shows that the closeness of the difference in the way that the groundwater is feeding into the streams. So here's an example from Pigeon River in Michigan, and just to, you know, to outline that where these springs come in. Here's a big one here. You know, you get these little side channels. It's generally wider. They tend to, when the springs come in, it's like the stream becomes a connect the dots between the streams. And so the outsides of the bends are no longer like we think of them for meandering plan form in a stream that's runoff driven, which might be like a sharp bag. These tend to be wide and maybe mucky, again, from that spring bringing up the wetland soils. Here's some other examples of wetland streams. These are kind of single thread. You see where there's pockets of the springs coming in, and then how uneven the banks are, and then you get a lot of, you know, maybe animal activity in here too. just showing how uneven all the edges are and how connected it is even during this base flow condition. So there's basically water everywhere in here. So one of the things when we talk about patterns, and we don't talk about multi-channel streams all that much, and sometimes they're referred to as braided. When we're in the kind of the low gradient setting, they're more like anastomosed. Anastomosing is a term that we use for those where they're vegetation driven. They're the channels kind of act independently of each other. Whereas when we're in a braiding system, this is down on the bottom here, that's more active laterally, and the channel overall is connected, and you have these very mobile sandbars that are moving around, or gravel bars. So kind of higher energy environment for those. But this kind of gives an idea of like, here's the single thread version, here's the anabranching or that multi-channel version. And as they go from not being very active, kind of maybe depositional, it's not very laterally changing to more active laterally, like meandering streams, kind of meander in a zone, right, from side to side within their meander zone. So some examples of the braided rivers. You have a lot of bed load, generally lack of vegetation. Anastomosing channels, some examples. This is the Chippewa River Delta into the Mississippi, just downstream of Lake Pepin. There's another example from the Rio Negro in Brazil. And you see how abundant the vegetation is. One thing, like, we did some studies up in Duluth area, kind of pre and post one of the big floods, and just to confirm that these, this is a wetland headwater channel, didn't change much. So there could be some incision, but again, kind of depending on how flat. So there might be some vertical cutting, depending if there's like ditching or anything below. But in general, they don't change much during runoff events. They don't move around. There's not a lot of sediment production happening in them. Some artificially made base flow systems. This is from Maryland, Chesapeake Bay tributary. So you can see that they have this direct connection with the floodplain pretty much all the time, not just as a surface that flood flows come out on. If we look at the Roskin level 1 or Roskin classification, these channels, and again, you can kind of see the difference between the braided, which is like the D, and you can see that the Roskin had grouped in less than 4% slope, so pretty steep systems. These would be more like the DAs with that less than 0.5% situation and vegetated and anastomosing situation. One of the other, like if we get into I didn't have time to like go into stage 0, and I did debate about throwing a channel evolution diagram in here. But one of the kind of evolution triangles that is being used now, this is comes out of the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, is this evolution triangle between hydrology, geology, and biology. And just to emphasize the importance of the three interacting. And on the geology side, that's kind of the physical constraints, could also be the engineering constraints. And one thing that Janine Castro had emphasized in their paper that she did with Colin Thorne a few years ago was how, when we look at even like geologic time, we start out with these channels that didn't have a whole lot of vegetation. They may be more in that braided situation. And as the amount of plant life grew, then we had these channels that then we have evidence for that's more anastomosing setting. So just to kind of to emphasize the importance of the biologic component to it. Oops, wrong way there. And so kind of looking at those, then this is called a process-based approach for restoration. And there's definitely different process-based approaches, right? Just kind of emphasizing those three components. And, you know, thinking about rigs, like if there's like a ditch situation, that's something that was dredged, it was made, engineered, it's going to kind of be down more towards the geology side of things. And the spring seeps, you know, maybe where the channel hasn't been modified, it is shifted more towards the biology or that vegetation that it's surrounding by, and then including the hydrology as well, but hydrology in terms of the base flow and the groundwater. And so the way that this triangle goes is that the evolution then happens within this kind of circle of the balance between these three features, these three major things. So it's a little bit different than the stream functional pyramid, where you kind of have this base of the hydrology and the hydraulics. So this is very much more like kind of flood-based, runoff-based streams. The geomorphology, that's all kind of based on those hydraulic geometry equations that are related to flood sizes. And then you have the biology on top of that. So the other triangle kind of like shows the balance and the importance of the vegetation or the biology in helping to form those channels. And so the metrics then that kind of go along with the stream quantification tool that's built off of the functional, the stream functional pyramid. These are some of the characteristics that are measured. It's kind of driven by the single thread channel situations, although there's some recognition of the being able to do it for the multi-channel as well, but pretty much kind of more in that single thread example. Another situation, you know, with beavers where you get that multi-channel situation, the water table is high, right? And so it's kind of occupying the entire valley bottom or the floodplain. And it's also helping to like spread out the floods. Like it's not like the floods are then occupying in the flood surface, the floodplain surface. It's like being and mitigated even before by just the spreading out of the water across that surface and within potentially multiple channels. So one of the things I think I'm pretty close to the end here, but just wanted to say with the kind of measuring metrics for success, it's much easier to do that in a single thread channel. And we're kind of geared towards doing that in many things that we do, from channel cross sections to how we do bank erosion, and everything else is very linear or cross section based. This is like the example from the National Engineering Handbook of like what would be a truly restored system. Again, kind of showing multi-channels, the role of vegetation. These are some of the most biologically diverse systems that you have. Very hard to measure, right? People kind of avoid them at all costs because it would take forever, right? So then we have to think of how we kind of take our maybe linear measurements and turn them into aerial measurements, or use some remote sensing techniques to do that in order to really be able to look at what the success is. And again, like it's a picture of a spring coming in along a stream with the kind of siltiness, the uneven banks where this happens, and this very low floodplain. And so with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Kelly. Thanks.
Thank you, Faith. All right, let me
I'm gonna stop sharing if I can find that, but there it is.
Absolutely. All right, our next presenter today is Mike Engel. Mike is a private lands biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program. He enjoys meeting with landowners to listen to their goals and walk their land. Projects that benefit rare and declining species are his favorite. Mike wears many hats, including biologist, project manager, grant writer, and contract administrator. He has experience restoring wetlands, streams, prairies, and savannas, and he likes to connect the value of individual actions to strategic initiatives and larger conservation goals using GIS and other prioritization tools. Mike will be presenting today on impairment diagnosis and reference reach, as well as desired outcomes, site limitations, and risk analysis.
All right, thanks, Kelly, and thanks, Faith. I've seen at least one question in the chat that I think an audience member answered, so that's great. I started talking about this concept kind of in the fall of 2023 and had a lot of great conversations along the way with the other panelists and some of the folks who are attendees today. And it's been a wild ride and a lot of fun learning about various things. Faith did a good job of pointing out how these riparian and wetland systems are not just geology or hydrology or biology. They're a combination of all of those things and probably many more. And I want to thank all of our sponsors again. It's been fun chasing down dollars to help us do this project. And if I can figure out how to advance, okay, here we go. So Fred talked a little bit about the property and where we sit. And so here in green are our protected areas along the East Fork of Raccoon Creek, which is right here. If you can see my cursor flowing to the north. Our property we're talking about today is right here in the southeast. So just want to give you a little bit of context. And then I know we have folks from, whoops. We have folks from multiple states, Illinois, hopefully some folks from, I think, Iowa and Oregon as well. So just a little bit of context about where we are. Madison, Wisconsin, the state capital is here. Milwaukee, our largest city. Chicago is just down here. And then Rockford, Illinois here. And here's our Briggs Wetland just to the west and north of Beloit. A little bit closer, zoomed in there. Again, here's Beloit and Broadhead over here. And then just dialing in a little bit closer in terms of where we are. And then on the slide, I put the essentially an address. There's not an address, but a lat long, and it is open to the public. So folks can go visit the site and enjoy it for all of its values. So, my job is to talk a little bit about what's going on out there and so forth. And we got a nice drone image here from Ducks Unlimited from this spring, and then a LiDAR image as well. On the top, we have our reference reach, which you can hopefully see is rather shallow, connected to the natural ground, and it goes from kind of a single channel to multiple channels. And then our target area, our degraded area here, is a spring that is a singular straight channel. And again, in our drone image, we can see a little sinuosity there, and it maybe gives you a hint that it's a stream. But if we look at our general land office records and so forth, we don't think this was ever a stream. So, one of the things we try to do is figure out what is the situation and what caused any degradation before we figure out how we're going to fix it. That's not always easy to do. We have in the Midwest, we have more damaged and degraded wetlands and streams than we do pristine ones. So figuring out what all the changes were and how they occurred is not always easy. But in this case, we have an image from 1937. And again, our reference area is here, and our degraded area is here. You can kind of see a faint little line here that water is flowing. But then in 1950, we really can see that straight line. So what caused that line to get more defined, and why is it so darn straight? These soils aren't really conducive to tiling, so we don't think it ever had drainage tile to make it more conducive for pasture or crops. It could have had some encouragement from like a moldboard plow. Someone might have plowed a line and made it straight. There's not any spoil piles out there. Those could have eroded away over time. The other theory is that changes in land use, grazing, we could have had some erosion, some compaction, degradation, and then possibly, kind of major events, whether it's melt, large rain events, a series of wet years in a row, that degradation was able to form kind of its own channel. And then we have some more aerial images we're going to look at. Some of them aren't very great, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of context how the landscape has changed over time. So these images are particularly bad, 1966 and 1993, but you can kind of see, again, here's our channel, our reference area is still a little more consistent, definitely some land use changes here. And then in 1993, definitely some changes. 1993 was a really wet year in the Midwest, lots of flooding on the Mississippi River and so forth. And something you might be able to see is on the East Fork of Raccoon Creek, we're starting to see some beaver activity. And then in 2000, that changes with the beaver activity are even greater. We can still see our straight channel and then our reference area. We are seeing a lot more buckthorn growing out there, seeing some land use changes, some more buildings, homes being built, and that's changing as well, because as we transition to 2023, our most recent aerial photo, we can see some of these areas that were crop fields are now essentially set aside areas. And then we can see that our beaver activity is much more intense. So you're going to see this table again in James's talk. But, again, as I said, we want to try to figure out what's going on with this site. What is the degradation? What's happening? What caused the negative things before we try to figure out how to fix them? And so, like, here's just a really easy example. And these are pictures from the site, 2 different springs, sand bubbles, and one, someone who drank a lot of Pepsi decided to throw their Pepsi cans into the spring. So, the easy identification of the degradation is there's trash in the spring. So to improve it, we could remove those cans, but that's pretty easy, straightforward. We're not often blessed with those kind of problems. We often have more systemic problems that it's a little tricky to figure out what's going on. So here's some images. Remember, I'm a biologist, not an engineer or a geomorphologist. Brittany will get into a little bit more of this. But I just want to give you some comparisons of what we have here. So on the right is our target of the degraded stretch. Again, you see a little sinuosity there. We have some decent wetland vegetation adjacent to it because the site's recovered pretty well. And then on the left, we have a reference area where you can see there's much more similarity between the ground surface and the water flow. If we look at that in a different way, and again, I'm a biologist, so my charts are more crayon than AutoCAD. But if you look at the top set of lines, that's our reference, and you can see the surface is the kind of the brownish orangish color, and that reflects very similar to the blue line, which is the kind of the ditch bottom or the base of the stream. And then the lower section is again the kind of tan color is the ground surface, and the blue is the ditch bottom of that straight channel. And you can see how there's some major differences. And both the reference and the target have nicks at the origin of where the springs come out of the ground, and that's kind of a transition from a Rockton loam to a Ciboa silt loam. So that Rockton loam has bedrock very near the surface, so that groundwater is coming out of the ground and starting to flow. cross sections of our reference and our degraded section. I tried to keep the scale similar to demonstrate the comparison. So the vertical feet are different in terms of the elevation, but the scale is the same. They're both 3.5 feet vertical difference from the top of the chart to the bottom, and both are 25 feet wide. So you can see that our degraded channel is much deeper and much wider than our cross section of our reference. So now to talk about outcomes that we want a little bit. First, there's two things we have going on. I'm basically a project manager is my job. I try to get projects through the process of getting them restored and functional, and then moving on to the next project. This one we kind of tap the brakes, and we're thinking about how we can use the site not only as an enhancement to wetland and stream function, but how can we use it as a teaching example? And it's going to have some shortcomings as a teaching example, and it's going to have some strengths. So one of the things we're doing is we're doing monitoring. We put some monitoring wells out there to help us compare what's going on with groundwater now versus what will be going on with the groundwater after we have installed our beaver dam analogs. The lateral effect in these soils from the ditch is about 100 feet. It's very coarse and grainy. So if we have a 3-foot deep ditch, we're sucking water in about 100 feet. So we have these water monitoring wells about 10 feet from the ditch, and then about 30 feet from the ditch, about midway, and then at the end of where our beaver dam analogs will be. And we have one installed on the reference reach as well. We have some water temperature monitoring gauges in the stream, so we can address, are we cooling the water? Are we making the water warmer? That's one of the concerns with cold water fisheries. We don't want our activities to degrade our cold water stream. And then one of the things that kind of got this project going is I was out here in the about the mid 2000s and looked at the site and basically said, I don't think there's anything we can do here doing the Hippocratic Oath of a medical doctor. I thought the cure was going to be more damaging to the good wetland vegetation than the medicine was going to merit. But now we have some new tools in our toolbox. Want to emphasize, as James will, that none of these tools are magical. They all have their benefits and their drawbacks. But we found out a few years ago that the site is home to a rare dragonfly, which is pretty exciting. And we invited some experts out there who know a lot about the dragonfly. And it was interesting. They kind of told us that this ditch was not great for the dragonfly. The dragonfly has a lot of similarity in its habitat needs, especially as a larva, to this guy, the brook trout, which is in the East Fork of Raccoon Creek. And brook trout, they like cool or cold, clean water, but they also like a little bit of silt and sediment and woody debris, and they like channels with a little complexity. And it turns out that's what the dragonfly larvae like as well. They don't like a hard, sterile bottom. And the interesting thing about the dragonfly is that they often use crayfish burrows as part of their life cycle. The larva will actually live in the crayfish burrow. And there are some folks who probably joined us today because they're excited about charismatic megafauna like beavers, but I think we also need to recognize that there are other charismatic megafauna like crayfish who are out creating these burrows out there that are changing the landscape.
Hey, Mike.
Yep.
Before you go on, and because we are going to enter a break after your portion of the presentation is done today, we have someone with a raised hand for a question. Would you mind taking that now?
Sure.
All right. Tristan, did you have your hand raised? Maybe not. All right, Tristan, if you do still have a question, I'm gonna lower your hand for now, but raise it again and we can come back to you.
All right, so this site has a lot of redeeming qualities. It's in pretty good shape. It has a very small watershed. It includes uplands, side slopes, and stream terrace. It's probably not a stream, but if it were a stream, it'd be like in a stream order 0, one of those really small, tiny streams without a name. And we're collecting data on the site to hopefully demonstrate to people that what we're doing is going to be beneficial. I know some of the interest in this topic were about permits, and when you're working with streams, cold water fish are certainly a concern. So that's again why we're going to be monitoring temperature and again monitoring what the groundwater is doing, that we are hopefully going to increase the amount of subsurface water that will filter through the soil, be cleaned and cooled before it is returned to our cold water stream. But some of the things this site is not, which are not good examples for these techniques, is it's not in the floodplain. We are just outside the floodplain. So on this slide, we're essentially going to stop work about where the floodplain starts. And that is because the slope just gets too shallow there. The difference between the surface and the ditch bottom, it's just minuscule. So that makes it easier for us for sure. But it doesn't help us demonstrate with our permit givers from the DNR that how to work through these things. So that is a disadvantage, but it's something for folks to be aware of, that you're going to be working in the floodplain and putting in structures. Wisconsin has a lot of consternation about how to deal with these structures and what to call them and how to permit them. Other things this site has a disadvantage of, unfortunately, is we are not in the Great Lakes Basin and we are not in the driftless area. We're kind of right in between the two. We are in Mississippi River watershed, but there's a lot of funding to work in the driftless area and there's a lot of funding to work in the Great Lakes watersheds, and we're just in between. So that's a disadvantage. But again, I think the lessons we learn are going to be transferable to other parts of the state. This site is not highly degraded, so that is, a lot of the sites, like I said, and Faith said, a lot of our streams and wetlands are in pretty bad shape. So we were not a great example for those. And we're trying to have a very light hand here. We're not going to bring in the big yellow trucks or bulldozer and excavators and change the site too much, because the existing vegetation is pretty good. I'm kind of thinking of it more of like a diet than having surgery. The other thing this site doesn't have is it's not about adding sediment. So many of our streams in Wisconsin, there are inches to gobs and gobs of feet of sediment on top of them. This stream actually doesn't have that. So not a good example for that, where we're trying to reconnect a floodplain by raising the stream back up to where all that dirt is now. I mean, our site has pretty low channel complexity too. And I think, just kind of wanted to end here with this cartoon and an analogy that, again, we always want to try to figure out what's going on with a site. Where is the water coming from? Where is it going? How did that look historically? What is the best case scenario for the vegetation, the water, and everything else? And we want to be careful that we don't start using our hammer to pound in screws. We use the right tools for the right goals and focus on the goals. And I think it's pretty easy to, look at Humpty Dumpty laying on the ground and just start getting excited about the glue and starting to glue the pieces together without thinking about what the end goal is. So if you just start gluing all those pieces of eggshell together, who knows what you're going to end up with? But it might not look like Humpty Dumpty. So just a word of caution for our enthusiasm for anything new and shiny. And again, this is my house, and I'm trying to decide what color to paint the walls. But I don't think if I have red walls, or blue walls is really going to help the structural integrity of my house, right? So again, when we're thinking about our streams and wetlands, take a step back, do the hard questioning of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve, and are you going to make it better or worse? That is what I have to share with you today.
Great, thank you, Mike. I believe that we built in a little bit of a break, just knowing that we're gonna go for 2.5 hours here today. And we built that in for right about now. So we were initially anticipating maybe about a 10-minute break, but I'll say let's maybe just pause, as it hasn't been a full hour yet. And we'll pick back up right at 11. And we'll hear from James and Brittany at that point. So I'm gonna pop just like a splash screen up on the webinar for now, and we'll reconvene in about 7 minutes at 11. All right, it is 11 o'clock, so we'll pick back up. And just a reminder, any questions you have, some of you I've noticed the raise hand feature, so definitely if you want to ask your question out loud to the presenters, if you use the raise hand feature, I can allow you to unmute yourself so that you can ask the question. Otherwise, feel free to keep using the chat and the Q&A feature for any questions that you have. Our next presenter today is James Broadzeller. James currently serves as the watershed coordinator at the Dane County Land and Water Resources Department, where he focuses largely on the stream and wetland restoration component of the department's ecosystem services program. Prior to his work at the county, James spent 6 years in the waterway and wetland program at Wisconsin DNR and 4 years as the monitoring lead for data collection for development of a total maximum daily load for the Wisconsin River. James will be presenting today on process-based restoration, fundamentals, practices, and regulatory considerations.
Thank you, Kelly. Screen share a success. All right, so before we dive in, I want to make a bit of a kind of opening remark and maybe a preface statement. We heard from I will call a professional expert fluvial geomorphologist to start the day in Dr. Fitzpatrick. My kind of intent here is to compile the wealth of information that's out there kind of under the process-based restoration umbrella, convey that information. I consider myself more of a student in the stream and wetland practitioner world than an expert. I think we're all always learning. So to share some of that literature, some of the general concepts, and some of the things to be aware of on the regulatory side as you're starting to consider some of these practices on the sites that you work on. And if you're wondering what the heck is a guy from Dane County doing on a project in Rock County, Mike and our partners at Ducks Unlimited, we do a ton of restoration work on county properties. Dane County owns and operates about 18,000 acres of public land. And we are looking more and more at evaluating the feasibility of implementing some of these practices on our county wildlife areas and natural resource areas. So here I am today. So to help set the stage a little bit, again, the problems that a lot of us are working to fix and address: streams that have become disconnected from their floodplains, streams that have been channelized, or wetlands that have been ditched and drained largely to accommodate agriculture, some not so good land use practices, and all of the above is really getting exacerbated as of late, as we're starting to see more frequent and higher magnitude rain events. So this is just one of the graphics from the UW-Madison Nelson Institute, forecasting out the number of annual days where we're seeing more than 2 inches of precipitation falling in 24 hours. And I think that's a reasonable and accepted event size where you start to getting into, bankful flows and bankful discharges, which is when you start to get more of your channel changing and your channel formation processes really working. So to rewind, we used to look at severely eroding stream bank like on the top left. And a pretty common approach to that would be to peel and shave the banks back flat out, and top dress that with some riprap or hard armoring to address the erosion issue and kind of lock that stream channel in place and stop the lateral movement. Similarly, photo on that bottom left there, a channelized small river or creek. A common approach to restoring something like that would be to put the wiggle back by, bringing heavy equipment, doing some mechanized land clearing, and really carving in that new channel in that new riparian area like you see on the bottom right. So kind of taking it right from degraded to that turnkey setting, right, where anglers can come in and start fishing in the thing right away. And usually looking a little bit narrow in scope, right? Sometimes that's limited by property ownership or other factors, but that's something we're trying to start to zoom out and look at these things at more of a reach or watershed scale. I struggled with the title for this slide a lot. I told a colleague I changed it about 2 or 3 times. So evolving, evolutionary. I just want to clarify, you know, a lot of the bullet points here and how the restoration philosophies are changing over the years. It's really driven by a lot of the fluvial processes that Faith introduced us to earlier this morning. And really, you know, kind of resetting things and letting Mother Nature do the work. So some of the terms that you may have heard in the literature or in, you know, similar conversations like we're having here: prompted recovery, process-based, strategic nick points, just really, you know, getting the restoration started and then being a little bit more hands-off and letting those processes do the work instead of diesel fuel and heavy equipment. Again, starting to look at this at, you know, more of a reach or a watershed scale. I think just before the break, somebody had put something into the Q&A about a statewide beaver assessment study in Minnesota. And, you know, one of the suggestions from those findings is that, you know, the successes from the, you know, this beaver mimicry that we're going to be talking about here really is dependent on the underlying condition of, you know, the watershed, the overall ecosystem. So I think that was a very timely reminder that we have to be looking at these things as holistically as we can. Use some more natural materials, right? The Wood is Good logo, that we're starting to try to utilize wood to do some of the jobs that that rock had done in the past. Make a mess, another growing concept, right? Within reason, this is always going to be site specific, but nature likes things messy. And I think a lot of the times, you know, we can get kind of hung up in the engineering precision and the design and build and execute. You know, I was saying, when you're whatever problem you're thinking about, spend 90% of that diagnosing the problem and 10% of the time working on the solution. So I think that principle does apply here as well. So this is the table that Mike had shared. I want to come back to it. I think you know, it's a good starting point and a good reminder to really focus on those 4 principles on the left-hand side. Make sure you're targeting the root cause or root causes of change. Tailor your restoration actions to local potential. So, you know, a quick example of that, if you're working in a, you know, maybe a marginal or cool cold water stream, and you're trying to, you know, bring that into a self-sustaining reach for a trout stream, you're probably not going to plant a couple of, you know, new oak trees that'll shade 10 feet of the stream and achieve that, right? Match the scale of the restoration to the scale of the problem. You know, to an example in the context of the Briggs site here, if the problem is downstream flooding and we're looking to, you know, do something to keep some of that runoff on site, shave the peak off the local hydrograph. You'll see in Brittany's presentation, we're working with a catchment here that's all like 13 or 14 acres, right? Probably not going to achieve that desired outcome by working with that amount of water. And be very explicit about your expected outcomes. We're going to kind of weave that into the outcome-based permit applications a little bit later. Some more riverscape principles. So these come out of some literature from Dr. Joe Wheaton. Maybe I'm going to back up to this last slide here. So Anabranch Solutions is, I think he's kind of the principal of that company. A lot of this stuff under this low-tech process-based restoration umbrella that you hear about is coming out as some of those Wheaton materials and out of Utah State University. A lot of those practices, again, are focused on structure, which is just one piece of the, you know, the whole process-based restoration puzzle. So structure forces complexity and builds resilience. Inefficient conveyance of water is healthy. You may have come across this saying, slow it down and spread it out. So Faith had talked a little bit about channel types and channel forms. You know, I think there's a growing thought that a lot of our streams in Wisconsin and the Midwest landscapes used to be more of these anastomatosing, kind of vegetation-driven, small, diffuse type channel settings initially, when there was a lot more wetlands, a lot more grasslands, and a lot more forest on the landscape. Important note, right? Importance of structure varies. So if you're working in the northern latitudes of Wisconsin, right, your vegetation, your wooded component's going to be a lot different than if you're working something in southeast Wisconsin down in more of a till plain setting. And streams need space. So I think you know, a great example of that, look at the Mississippi River Valley. Lots of protections, lots of space to move and conduct these natural fluvial processes, with the result being a beautiful, rich, and biodiverse type landscape. So two of and these are probably terms or acronyms you may be familiar with already, but again, under that low-tech process-based restoration umbrella, beaver dam analogs and post-assisted log structures. So there are definitely a lot of similarities between these two practices, but there are some differences that we're going to get to in a bit. But basically, they are, piles of wood and using natural materials strategically placed in different points throughout the channel to accomplish different things. So there are some that are full channel spanning. If a goal may be to capture sediment to raise the elevation of this inside section of stream. You can key these into a banks to, induce incision and scour and try to do some sort of a natural remeandering approach. So there's a lot of different applications from these two. I was going to share a short video from the Nature Conservancy, just get an illustration of what these things look like. Again, in the sake of time, we're going to share these slides afterwards. So if you want a short 2-minute promo for, what beaver dam analogs can be used for in more mountainous west setting, take a look at that. Some other views from some of the Joe Wheaton design manual. Again, these beaver dam analogs can be constructed with posts, like we're thinking about doing for most of the structures at the Briggs Wetland site, or they can be postless. So that kind of middle cross-section view on the left side of the screen here, that's a postless setup, and it's not going in if you want, a 4-foot crest elevation like you see in the top left there. It's not dumping 4 feet of material in the stream and walking away. It's kind of using like what I call a lasagna approach, where you pack some in, let it consolidate and settle, and kind of construct it in layers. How these things work, river systems, stream systems, they're dynamic. Things are always moving. Things are always changing. So that's one of the big design principles behind these. You're not going to construct one of these structures, and have a reasonable expectation to achieve your goals. The strength in numbers concept, and I will go back to an epiphany that Mike Engel shared with me when he was out trout fishing last week, hopping over guardrails, getting into streams. The approach in these things operate and work similar to how a guardrail does, right? When a vehicle smashes into one of those things going 70 miles an hour down the freeway, a couple of those posts are going to shatter, right? That absorbs the initial energy from the crash. The rest of the structure wraps that car up, brings it, down to speed before it hops into the other lane. So these things work in a similar fashion. I thought that was a very good analogy. And adaptive management. We'll talk about this a little bit more. But some of these, they may start out as a channel spanning structure. The intent may be pond in a grade, and they may be changed to more of a keyed in flanking structure to start to induce remeandering years later. So some of the potential, and again, that LTPBR acronym, low-tech process-based restoration applications addressing incision or entrenchment. I know there are some differences between those two terms. For all intents and purposes, I'm going to use them the same today. But this is a section of Lower Black Earth Creek in Western Dane County, on one of the Dane County parks, that we're looking to restore. Floodplain connection is really the primary goal of this project. And as you can see, bank full is on average maybe 1.5 to 2 feet below top of bank. So not the the most incised channel out there. So we did think about, would this be a potential site to use structures like this? It is a large drainage area. You can see it's a pretty wide channel, so we thought that wasn't the best fit. Plus, this is a really heavily recreated river, not only in terms of angling pressure, but folks that like to canoe and kayak. So those structures can present kind of coexistence issues with that, which we'll talk about more later as well. One point to make, and I think Faith had touched on this a little bit here, just the difference between aggradation and degradation. So the incision and entrenchment in this channel is attributed to both of those, likely being, again, a Lower Black Earth Creek, probably about 100 square mile drainage area. Likely more of that entrenchment and that disconnection from the floodplain is over the last hundreds and hundreds of years, just accretion in the floodplain versus down cutting. It's a pretty firm bottom currently. So going back to the Briggs site, Mike had shared the kind of the air photo progression. I have some of the same in here. So what things looked like in 1937, a horrible photo from the mid 60s, early 2000s, and then what that site looks like currently. So really what we're trying to achieve out there, like Mike mentioned, East Fork of Raccoon Creek, word on the street from one of the DNR fish techs that I heard a few weeks ago is that that section actually has one of the most sustainable populations of brook trout and also a really healthy population of red-side dace as well, which I believe is still a T&E or some sort of special concern species in Wisconsin. So a big driver is, try to more of that spring flow subsurface moving laterally to help with base flow maintenance and to help buffer temperature increases in the creek. I will note, we did look at kind of, Faith had mentioned the stage 0 approach. Again, some folks may be familiar with. If you're not, it really is grounded in these stream evolution models and these fluvial processes that Faith walked to. I just shared a couple of the papers. These are not, totally new ideas. That older ones, a USGS publication from the late 80s, and the Clear and Thorn paper as well. So, we looked at maybe just doing a ditch plug or two in the upper reach of that and just, letting the channel either go offline or reform itself. I think one of the big drivers and why we landed as kind of smaller scale per dam analogs is, abiding by what the land steward and the property owners have for management goals out there. And it is, there is a very nice kind of wet prairie plant community out there. And there are some concerns out there from a number of folks. If you do, make that wetland too wet, it may be vulnerable to hybrid cattail invasion or some of those other, shallow marsh obligate type species moving in there. So I think it's important to remind ourselves, the designer, the practitioner. I know one of the natural areas leads from Dane County is on here, and I get giddy with these ideas. I want to go big. I want to do what's ideal in terms of reference and hydrology. But for the Dane County folks in the Parks Department, they're the ones like really putting the sweat into maintaining these properties. And like I said, adaptive management is a big part of this. Not, construct these BDAs or dump some wood in the stream and walk away. It does take time to achieve your restoration goals. So I think it's really important just to make sure that we're not pushing landowners too hard and we're finding that balance if we really want to start to move some of this process-based restoration stuff to scale. Some potential other applications. So this is the slide, on the cover slide of my presentation. This is Marsh Creek, Dane County property just outside the Lower Wisconsin State Riverway, ditched and straightened a number of years ago, and we're evaluating potentially using some of these BDA types or PALS type structures as a natural remeandering approach out there. Real good setting it for that in terms of risk management. It's all county property. You can kind of see the topography goes up on both sides, so we're in more of a confined alluvial valley type setting. So the potential for that thing to, short circuit or side cut further than we wanted on the private land is really limited out there. Every time I give one of these talks, credit right away to Marty Melchor with Interfluve, a name some of you folks may be familiar with. I did peel off, you'll see on the tire slide. In my mind, this is starting to maybe get beyond the low tech. It's definitely still process-based and natural materials. But some of the other practices I just wanted to share. Root wads is a structure folks are probably familiar with. They can be used dually for bank stabilization and in-stream habitat for trout and other species. A lot of other benefits to them. You can see here come from these before and after photos, right? Aesthetics, if you're working with agricultural operators, municipalities, if these are in parklands, they want these things not to be too messy, like we talked about before. So, these type of practices can achieve those types of goals as well. One other notable, if you're working in, say, the central part of Wisconsin, where it's a lot of natural shifting sand bottom streams, Wood is great habitat for macroinvertebrates in those types of systems where you don't have as much of those, you know, gravel and small cobble type voids for bugs in the stream. Similarly, again, you can use these on larger channels, create something that's a little bit more two-stage, have a floodplain bench. Using the same practices, you know, large wood and whole trees actually in riparian wetland habitats, a number of benefits that come along with that application, waterfall and amphibian habitat. It can be fish spawning areas, you know, being cognizant that there are ways for fish to be able to retreat back to the main channel, the perennial flow, as these inundated areas start to become not inundated following large events. Can really help balance sediment dynamics. And if you're looking at, again, the co-benefits piece of all this, can be very helpful in catching debris flows, large sheets of ice that are coming down during spring melt periods, so those aren't clogging up our bridges and taking out our roadways and things like that. A couple other applications just to roughen up that floodplain surface again, right? Try to utilize more of the floodplain, slow the water down, spread it out. And then it can really help as an aid as you're trying to reestablish riparian vegetation. I think Marty makes a great point here. You know, this is not a Midwest setting here by any means. But the type of wood, the amount of wood, that stuff is not meant to last forever. So here you can see, right, this is a thick blanket of popple that's come back in. That stuff is really fast growing. So, you know, your design life for some of your floodplain wood there may only need to be a handful of years. And it'll continue to do its work. We're doing a similar like that on a Black Earth Creek project in Dane County, where we're going to be planting, you know, some oak trees and some species that take a little bit longer to grow and establish. So we're actually going to be using black locust for folks that know what that, so that'll have a much longer lifespan in terms of how fast that will rot and degrade. So again, just, you know, some progression photo what these sites look like and how they can help restore riparian areas. So jumping back to the beaver dam analogs, again, I wanted to point out some of the differences between this practice and the post-assisted log structure. These really do, you know, they do work at like the full regime of flows in a stream or a river, right? Base flow all the way up to event flow, and kind of the primary applications for these, capturing sediment and ponding and diverting water. And, you know, a lot of the times you're going to construct these in complexes, multiple structures that are placed to kind of work in concert like you're seeing here. One of the most important points, right? Know your zone of influence. So if you're designing something, you know where that crest elevation is going to be. I think it'd be smart to, you know, these things are not designed to operate like a traditional dam where they are completely impermeable, right? Beaver dams are leaky. These are designed to kind of be the same way. But assume, you know, the top of those posts, your crest elevation, that's going to be your impoundment footprint. If you're using it to address an incised section of channel and restore riparian wetlands, right? If you bring that stream bed elevation up 4 feet, have a good idea what type of soils are out there and how far that rewetting is going to go, and if that's going to extend outside of your project site off the property. The impoundment footprint, again, Mike had mentioned this, you know, where are the abandoned floodplains, where are terraces, just know that area of inundation and the frequency, have a good idea of the underlying geology. If you're trying to, you know, reestablish sinuosity in a stream, it's going to be a lot different if you're doing that in a, you know, a deep stratified sand type setting versus something that has more of a gravel and a cobble component underlying like we have at the Briggs site. Idea of a historic reference and adjacent land use, and just make sure that you're thinking about offsite impacts and all those bullet points. That's just a sampling of, you know, being just, and it takes time and experience and a team of professionals to really be able to read the riverscape. So a quick before and after for this practice. Again, this is from the mountainous west. I wouldn't expect, unless you're I'll just say, very poorly managed watershed to expect 4.5 feet of aggradation after a 12-month period, right? This is a different setting, but just kind of shows how much work these things can do. So switching gears, post-assisted log structures, these, this approach is going to do more of its work at high flows. I think the primary use of these is to mimic natural debris and wood accumulation in streams. I will say this is not the most representative photo here for Wisconsin. I selected this for a couple reasons, just to demonstrate right now, those structures don't look like they're doing much of anything. Wait till the snowpack comes off. And I'll just flash this yellow line up and on, that's kind of general top of bank location. And we're going to get into this in the regulatory discussion a little bit more. Just know where those top of posts sit when you're designing these. And that's something that DNR is going to be wanting some information about. So this is a more applicable photo. This was shared by our friends of the Wisconsin Association, I believe, from their Marengo River project. You can see here, with the exception of that kind of outlier post off near the bank, on the bottom left, the top of those posts, kind of the crest elevation of that structure is significantly below bank. I think they had a kind of an ask or a threshold to keep the top of those structures a little over a foot below top of bank at that site. All the same concepts apply, right? No zone of influence. This is one thing I'm always kind of advocating for and thinking about, regardless if it's process-based or whatever type of restoration you're doing, right? How can you maximize co-benefits? So I think this does apply to a lot of these low-tech process-based practices and the water quality side, right? You're capturing sediment, helping to pull out a lot of that absorbed phosphorus. And in some applications, not all, just reducing stream power can help reduce erosion. A paper that we'll be referencing a little bit later here, use stream power, not diesel power. So you're using less heavy equipment to construct these types of practices, and lowers disturbance and heighten sequestration. So if you are working, in a wide riparian wetland type setting, wetlands, anybody that's looked into kind of the greenhouse gas emission research for, non-coastal wetlands, they can be a sink or they can definitely be a source. A lot of the times that's attributed to, how anoxic those wetlands are. If there's more of a floodplain wetland setting, and there's a lot more wetting and drying cycles, they may be surging more CO2 in the atmosphere. So helping to keep those anoxic, not disturbing those wetlands, can really help with the carbon sequestration side. Flood and drought resilience. So we talked a little bit about that with the Briggs site on both sides of the extreme. Floristic quality. This can go both ways here. If you are in a medium-sized channel, wetland hydrology has likely been totally removed. So you can definitely, improve the FQI of that plant community by addressing that issue. Again, on the Briggs side, we're not in an incised channel setting, and there are some concerns about, accelerated eutrophication and having some adverse impacts on that plant community. So just be cognizant of that. Fish and wildlife habitat, this is also maybe call it a double-edged sword here. So, frogs and amphibians likely going to benefit from, more inundation, wetter wetlands. But we're going to talk about fish, and that's another, kind of critique and ongoing area of research around just fish movement and fish passage from putting these structures in streams. Fire protection maybe not as much in the Midwest. I know this is a big sell and a big benefit of these types of practices out west, right? You get a larger wetted perimeter, less dry and flammable vegetation, and there's been instances where some of these larger, whether it's natural or constructed beaver dam complexes, have been able to actually stop some of these new age mega fires from jumping over those stream and river valleys. And last, equitable costs. Again, this is, be careful about this one. If you have the materials on site, right, they don't take as much fuel to construct, the material costs may be lower, but the adaptive management piece, there can be more labor to manage these, over a 5, 10, 15-year period, adaptively, to make sure that they're doing their job. So there can be benefits there, but another thing to be careful about. So the last slide here before I turn it over to Brittany to talk more about design, and if you take anything away from my rambling this morning, I highly recommend reading that paper on that top first bullet point. This came to our panelists about a week before the webinar today, and it couldn't have been more well-timed. It is just a very honest, easy to read, transparent critique of what he calls this LT-PBR phenomenon. And there's more to it than just, the PBR logo on the right, an idea, not a brand. There's more to process-based restoration than just, addressing the structural starvation issues out there. So just very easy read, highly recommend that. And we are going to send it as part of our follow-up package after the webinar today. So like myself, right, we do this type of conservation work. Once we learn about these things and we're armed with this information, you're automatically an influencer. So just know, right, some people think these things are the best things since sliced bread. They're the silver bullet to all of our hydrologic restoration needs and problems. I think that's far from the truth. So don't lose sight of what we've been doing for a long time, right? If you want to address channel incision in a stream, raising the bed, lowering the floodplain, that is part of it. But if you don't address some of the larger issues, you don't focus on, land use practices, more perennial vegetation, addressing the runoff delivery components, you likely aren't going to fully address that issue. And, the kind of the tail end of that paper gets outside of the ecological, context and gets more into, I guess, the socioeconomic piece, or kind of under a different title. But these types of methods, they can be cheaper. That's not always the case. And it is not a, one structure or a one point in time project and walk away. It takes time to assess, design, and monitor and manage these types of approaches. So anyone can do it. There's some truth in that, right? You could probably bring your 10 or 12-year-old and he'd safely hop in the stream and help you build one of these and, weave the branches in between a BDA. But as far, coming up with a best fit design that really manages the risk component, it really does require a team of professionals and a cohort of folks to do that. So with that, I will pause and pass the torch over to Brittany.
I did just want to take, we have a couple questions coming through in the chat, and I do think we'll save some of them for the very end as more of discussion questions near the end of all the presentations. But we did have one question that related directly to a slide that you showed, James, in your evolving restoration concepts slide. So the question was, what does the strategic nick point refer to in that slide?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to go to a different visual to answer that. I think this one may be the best. Right, so take the two images in the top left for these bank attached pals. Say this is a channelized section of stream here, and you want to start to induce a little bit of scour on that upper or outside bank. Where you place that, within a certain meander bend, where where the point of tangency and the curve of the stream may be, where you have your highest energy. Being able to know and anticipate what is going to happen to that flow of water and what in the next step in the channel evolution is going to be. So when I say strategic nick point, it's, instead of using a bucket on an excavator to just carve out that new meander, it's placing a structure and forcing the energy to a different spot in the channel to try to, promote and initiate one of these fluvial processes. So hopefully that answers that question all right.
Thanks, James. And like I said, we'll address the other questions that are coming through the chat as well near the end, since I think they'll be good for some more discussion, and maybe multiple of our panelists will respond to some of those questions. So our next presenter is Brittany Aylen. Brittany is a regional engineer for Ducks Unlimited, serving Wisconsin and the Great Lakes Atlantic region for the last 2 years, with prior work at NRCS for 3 years. Ducks Unlimited assists partners with design and implementation of wetland restoration and enhancement projects in Wisconsin and throughout the country. That'll turn it over to Brittany.
Thank you, Kelly. Hi, everyone. Just wanted to pop on camera here. I'm going to turn it off for presentation because it's on my other screen, so I'll be looking sideways anyways. So we kind of got the background on things, and I'm going to run you through kind of what we ran through for the design on this specific site for the Briggs wetland here. So most of this is referenced to, again, what James was referring to as the BDA design manual, which a lot of it is based off of riverscape work out west. So a little bit different than what we're working with here, but trying to apply those principles to our site that we're working with. Let me see if I can share. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. All right, so first thing, Mike kind of mentioned this in his presentation, just looking at the soils that were out there. So he mentioned this Rockton on the upper end, right where our spring heads basically are. And then below is the Sebwa soils. So that Rockton does have bedrock, relatively shallow. So that coincides with where our springs are popping up. And that's just, you know, referring to there's that impervious layer and we're getting enough pressure that water is actually coming up out of the ground. And that's our base flow that's currently in the channel out there. And then that Sebwa underneath. So that's usually about a foot of the darker soil on top, and then it's underlain by sand and some gravelly stuff underneath. So our channel, looking at our channel, we've basically gotten down to this level with how deep it is currently on site. And so this is a photo. This is a photo of the reference or the old reach that it would have looked like. That one's much shallower than you can see the reach on the right currently. You know, the reference reach is probably 6 inches wide by less than a foot deep, and our new reach has gotten much wider. You can see there's a lot of vegetation on the slopes right now, but much deeper than the previous channel was in historic conditions, or the reference reach, sorry. And so when we're looking at the channel and the soils out there, one of the things that was also previously mentioned is your lateral effect from what's been happening. So you can see Sebwa, because it's a sandier soil, you have a large lateral effect that reaches out to the sides of that stream. And from being on site, that's something you can notice when you're out walking the site, that the vegetation is definitely different for that lateral effect zone than in, you know, the actual wetland areas that aren't affected by that ditch yet because they're further out. So, you know, clay or type soils, the distance is less because they hold water better than sand. The lateral effect is more out there. And typically, you know, our Briggs site has sand on it. A lot of streams and riverscapes have that sandy bottom. So that's where we're dealing with a large lateral effect on these sites and where the groundwater is definitely being affected with how deep these channels are getting and becoming versus what they were in history. And so Mike Engel did the original site visit out there, and he got some great survey data for us. So that's the first thing we looked at, was getting some good survey data out there and really evaluating what's currently going on, looking at the slopes that are currently out there and the elevations to see what we're going to be able to do out there. So this top one just shows the general profile of the stream. You can see it changes as you go. So up at the beginning where the spring heads are, you can see we have some steeper slopes where it drops off from the spring heads, and then it comes into a more constant slope throughout the rest of it until it gets down into the creek and actual floodplain area. So the cross sections you can see below there, I have the water level marked from on site. So that's the base flow level that we saw in the stream that day, compared to the full channel height that's available there. So when you're on site and looking to get some information on these streams, it's a good idea to get a great survey out there so you can get your profiles, and then also measure what the water is doing currently. So you can get an idea of what the base flow in that stream is, you know, the regular water flow versus the total capacity available for that stream. So we got quite a few cross sections out there to compare and evaluate that existing stream data to get flows and capacities. So then the watershed, as some of the previous people mentioned, it's a relatively small watershed we're working with, so a good experimental site for us. We're only working with about 13, 14 acres of watershed, but it is pretty steep up above, and most of it's either cropland, wetland, or there's a farmstead site right here across the road. So we have a pretty small watershed to deal with. And then from those statistics, I just quick ran some NRCS tools that are available to everyone. So our peak runoffs for different storm events are listed here. And then using our cross-section data and our profiles from the existing stream, using that channel section and the characteristics, we came up with a base flow from the current water level in that channel, which is about 2 to 3 CFS. You can see down in the right corner that flows through there regularly from the water coming out of those springs. And then if you go to the full bank flow in this scenario, so the total height of that ditch that's been carved out, you have a total capacity of 60.8 CFS. And if you look at the storms from that watershed, you can see that channel has basically deepened and widened enough that the 100-year storm is now completely contained in that channel, and we're not accessing the floodplain or the wetland outside of that channel currently, unlike it would have been in historic conditions. So historic conditions showed that we didn't have that channel, and it was really filtering through groundwater or filtering through the wetland in a non-channelized fashion. And so now you can see the difference between then and now, that pretty much all that storm flow is being taken through the channel. And so why did we want BDAs for this type of site? And so again, this is a little different compared to the big riverscape sites that they work on out west, but the slope is probably a little steeper than most streams, typical streams that we're working on, as well as the flow. So we want something that's going to span the entire channel, not necessarily just one of those, pals that's on one side of the bank diverting flow, because we don't necessarily want this to be meandered into some sort of old channel, since there wasn't a channel there to begin with. So some sort of channel spanning practice, and also our channel size isn't terribly big either. So a channel spanning practice is going to work better for this site, as well as our goals for the site. So previously, again, there wasn't a channel here, so we really want to mimic previously and get more of that water to laterally flow through the ground or filter out through the wetland site. And if we can, as James said, sedimentation isn't going to be the easiest on this site due to the size of the watershed and the conditions out there, but if possible, that would help restore our channel. And then also, again, that lateral effect to bring that back down to what it used to be and get more of that water to flow out laterally. So this is just a table from that BDA design manual. And this is, again, the main purposes of the primary BDAs are shown. And so we want to increase the frequency of the water going laterally or almost out of bank to filter through our wetland instead of channelizing into the ditched area there. So BDA design guidelines, we don't want to over-engineer this. So the big sticking point here is there is no design storm. There is no real design lifespan. So we don't want to try to get too far into the weeds on any of that. You can use some general guidelines if you have a certain base flow or a certain annual type event that you do want to be able to handle before you engage that floodplain. There are ways to do that with that spreadsheet that I showed. It's pretty easy to figure out what elevation and what area you need to take care of a certain flow versus when you want to send it, over the banks back into the floodplain. So it is possible to calculate that out, but we don't want to stick it to a certain design year, design storm or anything, so that we have some flexibility here. So the design storm and crust elevation with this one. So we want to restore normal flow to the floodplain area or get that water to flow laterally in the ground. So that we place the top of the crust at the top of the bank so that we should be filling our channel back up and the water should be flowing laterally instead of channelized down that area. But as I mentioned, there's other scenarios where you may want to take a certain amount of base flow or a low storm event. So you might set those crest elevations a little lower than top of bank or an overbank area before you activate that floodplain. Always important to as well look at restrictions that you may have on site, and that would include culvert elevations. We don't want to be backing up water into culverts or affecting neighbors or neighboring land. And that's where James had the comment, know your area of impoundment, your affected area prior to when you're setting those crest elevations. So as I mentioned, we chose to bring ours to the top of the bank to get that water to flow laterally. So basically what I did was a couple iterative processes here on the profile. And so starting at the top of the profile where those spring heads are located, the first dam or analog was placed so that water would basically be backed up to the same level as the top of those springs. And so after that, I placed them so that there would be 1 foot of tailwater on each analog. So these vertical lines show where the analogs would be, and then these lateral lines show where the water level would be. And so I played with a couple different scenarios, 6 inches, a foot, and 1.5 feet of tailwater behind each dam. And where that comes from is in the design manual. One of the biggest things that is worried about is scouring behind these. And what that does is it eats out the toe and then completely undermines the analog. So we don't want that to happen. So if we have some tailwater for the water, if there is water going over top of them, if we have tailwater on the backside to help avoid that scour as much as possible, that'll help prevent failure on our analogs. And so between the 3 different scenarios, I think 6 inches of tailwater was about 6 analogs. A foot, which is shown here, is about 8, and then less with 1.5 feet. So what was chosen here was 1 foot of tailwater for each analog, and that actually worked out very well towards the end, where the foot of tailwater basically matches up with existing ground elevation towards the end. So it seemed like a very good option to go with the way it ended, and then protecting those analogs before each other. So some of the stability concerns with these, larger pool areas created by the crest elevations can lead to breaches when overtopping. In this scenario, we have a pretty small channel and flows here. So we don't have a ton of pool area behind them. But if you have a case where you have a lot of pool area behind it, you can have a lot of water pushing on those beaver dam analogs and creating a lot of turbulent water when overtopping. As I mentioned, scour is also one of the big concerns because it can undermine the structure. Some of the structures I'll show in a little bit, they don't have any protection on the backside. So when water is dropping straight over those, there's a high chance for scour, and depending on your stream bed type, it can be worse for certain soil types than others. So that's where we think about the placement to provide the tailwater against the previous dams. As I mentioned, the stream bed material, you're gonna have some stream beds that are more erosive than others. So it's important to look at that soil type in the stream bed. And then in rivers with highly mobile substrate, such as sand-bedded rivers, where you have a higher chance for erosion, using additional posts, that's where redundancy comes in. That, if you use more, that's not always a bad thing to further protect and provide more stability. So then we had 8 proposed dams. So then as far as embedment, there's a few different opinions on this in the different design manuals. So it is dependent on your cross section. And that's where I was mentioning, you can have some mattresses on the backside versus the water falling straight over the end of the dam. So of course, the water falling straight over, as pictured on the right side, that's going to be where you're going to get more of a chance for scour, and that could undermine your post because it's really bringing that embedment length down versus if you don't have scour on the backside. And so most design manuals say 1/3 to 1/4 of the full post height should be embedded, and then some say up to 50%. There was a study done by NOAA over in the west part of the country where they put this little diagram down here together showing your post embedment depth versus your downstream material size. And that was all done in sandy soils, just due to the amount of scour that's possible in those soils. And so it's basically just showing that the smaller sand you have in your river bottom, typically you need a larger post length. But again, those are based off of some pretty large posts and larger bodies of water, but just a general trend to be noted. And then spacing, again, those are typically on these bigger sites, 18 to 30 inches is what the minimum spacing is usually listed as. Due to our channel size, ours would probably be about 6 inches from stake to stake, just because we're working with a smaller area. And in order to be able to construct them, we're going to need them a little closer together. So then as far as materials that we'll be able to use, so the whole idea is to use local or on-site materials. And so we'll need to get stakes, hardwood stakes, to weave the material in between for those BDAs. So those might be made, those might be bought. Otherwise, we're going to try to harvest material from on-site, branches and such from some of the dogwood, the willow out there. There's some brushier material out there. And then also, aside from the wood materials, we'll need some sort of packing materials as well to make those structures. So straw, mud, and sod would be used to fill in the voids between some of those twigs and branches so that we start holding water on those BDAs. And then Also, if cobbles and rocks are available, those are sometimes used again on the toe of those structures just to help assist with some of the scour protection. And then actual construction. So the big thing with constructing these is you don't want to force the water all into one spot. So you don't want it to be concave downstream, which is on the bottom right here, because that's going to force all the water into one spot and definitely create a scour hole right behind your dam. So we want the water to be flowing over these pretty parallel, so it's not all concentrating in one spot. So you can see the top 3 photos show the alignments that we're looking for, perpendicular to our banks so that the water is flowing parallel over top of it. And then also convex is a method used as well, because we're not forcing all that water into one spot like the concave. So when you're out in the field building these things, just want to make sure that we're not going to be forcing water into one spot. And so the idea on building these is to start from the bottom up. So generally build it in 6 to 12 inch lifts of material, and then pack it well between lifts to make sure that you're holding water. So put your first layer down and then pack some of the straw or sod in. And with each layer, you want to make sure that the water is holding before you go to the next, to make sure you're achieving your goal. So with these ones, like I said, some of them have mattresses on the backside and some of them are just left to flow over the top. Generally the ones with mattresses help avoid scour more. And so with about a 3-to-1 slope, you make those the bases pretty wide and then build up less and less from there. And so this is just repeated until the crest elevation is achieved that you were looking for. So you set your posts with the crest elevation in mind and then build up to there. And as I mentioned, the overflow mattress. So this is shown just behind the middle line of these structures, and that's basically giving an area for the water that's flowing over to flow onto versus crashing down into the channel right away. Continually plug it with mud and organic materials so that again, these don't have to be completely sealed, but we do want them to hold water. So using some of that organic material will help in that case. So here's some of the profiles and cross sections. I know James threw this up there earlier too. So showing the posts that are going in there, and you can weave those twigs and branches in between, and then the mattresses on each side so that we're not just having a straight drop off on the backside. You can see by the 2 circled areas, these are the areas that are going to help prevent scour, and that's why sometimes some rocks or cobbles are placed on those to avoid scour, and then also help hold down some of that material. And you can see on the bottom left, making sure if you are using posts that you're not placing them in a way that's going to help the structure fail. So posts that aren't quite plumb or put in the right direction may actually be more detrimental to your beaver dam than helpful. And so we want to make sure either these posts are straight up and down, or if you're using 2 lines of them, they can be faced inward toward each other, but we don't generally want them faced downstream with the water going in the same direction. So what are we trying to avoid out here is definitely avoiding undercutting and scour so that we're not undermining the structure that we are actually creating. And again, posts that will cause structural failure from the beginning just because they're placed incorrectly in the wrong way. But again, this is, as Mike mentioned, this is an experimental site. So it's going to be helpful to build them in a little bit different ways to kind of see see what's working best, what's maybe not working best. And then what the option that I threw up there with the 8 dams, so that's really a minimum that was come up with. So redundancy is important on these sites, so you can always go, you know, above the minimum if you don't think if there's not enough tailwater on the dam above you, you can add another so that maybe it performs better if you're seeing scour or whatnot. So it's really a monitoring and seeing how things are working to see how they were built well and then what can be improved on in the future. So some of the takeaways, just know the goals for your site. It's really your design and how you want these to look are going to vary depending on what you want for your site. If you're trying to re-meander something, if you're trying to activate the floodplain more, if, in our case, we're trying to really send that water more subsurface as it was originally. Don't try to over-engineer it. We're not trying to make dams that are taking 100-year storms here. So don't try to dig too much into that, and failure is okay. So these are meant to fail sometimes, and sometimes the beavers, you know, will come in and do their work. But we're gonna learn from it either way. But for sure, know your restraints and constrictions, who you might affect or who you could possibly affect, so that we're not having any offsite impacts. And again, redundancy is good on these sites. So with that, I'll send it back over to James.
And I know there's been a bump of activity in the chat and the Q&A, which is great. It looks like most of the questions are getting answered or addressed, both from panelists and from our attendees, which is awesome. But maybe I'll ask Kelly if there's anything that perhaps was specific to Brittany's content that we want to pause and answer before I close us out.
The only question that I saw come through that I don't think I've seen answered yet in the chat directly was when do you say that BDAs have done their work and shift gears or stop maintaining them?
I think that's it depends, and it's kind of a site specific answer. You know, if the intention of the practice may be, you know, you want to raise your stream bed elevation essentially and capture sediment to the top of your crest, and the stream bed is now flush with the top of those posts, maybe at that point it's reached its design life for that structure or for that specific point, you know, in the larger complex or reach that you're trying to restore. So I don't know if there is a definitive one size fits all answer to that one. All right, so for the last session, we wanted to close just with some things on the permitting side of things and some regulatory considerations. You know, some of the I think we're spending the most time in the fish passes and the fisheries component. That's, you know, outside of just being able to get your permit for your project, right? That's an extra ecological item that we all should be thinking about if we're doing work in streams. Get this going. All right, so we want to talk about, you know, what types of permits are out there, what type of approvals do you need for these types of practices? Talk a little bit about navigability, not so much in the sense of is the stream that you're working on, you know, going to be likely determined to be navigable by DNR or not, but more about obstructions to navigation and maintaining navigation in public waterways. Some of the informational requirement for small dams, again, fisheries component. Both, you know, in trout stream or kind of angler preferred and some of our native species, but also getting out into those riparian wetlands for some of our other game and species of concern that utilize those areas outside of stream banks as well. touch a little bit on map floodplains and some of the hydraulic modeling requirements that are likely or may come along with that. A quick sampling of some of the tools and resources that are out there, and again, leading towards, really telling the story of your impairment assessment, why you chose the type of design you chose, and being very clear and concise in what type of outcomes you're trying to achieve. So looking at kind of the three different tiers of regulatory approvals, right, we're working on a site in Rock County. So at the local county zoning office, they're going to administer shoreline and shoreline wetland zoning. They also administer the local floodplain ordinance with, assistance from DNR, and that's kind of passed down authority from FEMA at the federal level. Me being in Dane County, I know this is different from county to county in Wisconsin. Some areas there are local stormwater and erosional control requirements on top of the DNR through their stormwater and WPDS permit program, so be cognizant of that. Flooding and flowage easements, just to make it clear, right? If you're going to flood adjacent property, it's privately owned. You're not going to go through Rock County to achieve that. That's something you're going to work directly with that landowner on if you want to go that route. And then are you working in an active DAT-CAP drainage district? Again, you're going to need approvals from those folks as well. We're going to spend most of our time talking about the state. I know there are folks, that may be outside of Wisconsin or do work outside of Wisconsin. So I apologize if this doesn't fit the mold, but we are going to spend most of the regulatory time there. So Chapter 31, navigable waters, Chapter 31, dams, 28136 is the statute for wetlands. And then DNR, through their water management engineering staff, do help counties with technical assistance for, administering their floodplain ordinance. Federal level, I know we have some of the folks from the Corps on, which is great. The conversations I've had, the hope is if these, these BDAs and PAL type projects start gaining momentum, that utilizing some of their nationwide permits like Nationwide 27 may be an avenue to cover those types of activities through their authority, whether it's through Section 404 waters or Section 10 waters through the Rivers and Harbors Act, and then FEMA again at that federal tier. So what if you haven't heard, a few years ago there was a bill passed that mandated DNR to create a new hydrologic restoration general permit, and I throw through the Wetlands Association logo on this slide. So just a quick shout out to their team. In my mind, they were kind of the champion of this legislation and getting this permit to happen. And really the intent of this is to try to package up all these different layers of, needed state permits to try to streamline the regulatory process for these types of projects. There was a lot of meetings and conversations with a pretty large cohort of conservation practitioners. I see a number of our both attendees and panelists were part of that group. And also input from the Wisconsin Wetlands Study Council on that new general permit or GP. We were hoping to apply and use that permit for the Briggs site that we're going to be constructing later this summer into the fall. From what I've heard, there's been some unanticipated delays in that. I think some additional tribal consultation needs and perhaps some other items. So I don't know when it's going to be released and ready for public use. So kind of ... to be continued. If there is anybody from the DNR Waterways program on the line that has some updates, seeing that in the chat would be awesome. But as a contingency plan, we're going to look to be using the NR 353 general wetland restoration or conservation permit to cover that for Briggs. So there's a couple links here. You can find the draft materials, both the full permit and the application checks is on the DNR website. So I just wanted to share links for those. For folks that are familiar with DNR's general permits, this is not an all-encompassing list of the eligibility criteria. There are a lot of other criteria on there. So please, take a look at that. Be aware if you're looking to utilize this permit. A lot of those are pretty common, right? You can't build a stormwater pond into wetland, time of year restrictions if you're working in a cold water stream, things like that. What I wanted to focus on today is, the eligibility criteria that helps you build this narrative for what's the problem, how are you trying to address it, and what are you trying to achieve, right? So a number of different net environmental benefit or improvement to the public interest that can be demonstrated as part of that. So navigability, again, you know, in my eyes, as a water management specialist, that's clearly a navigable stream. But when you look at a structure like that, you know, is that a passive thinking in terms of I guess non-animal use, right? Recreational use, the public trust doctrine that the DNR administers that permit program, not just for, you know, fish, critters, animals, environment, water quality. There's also the human use value component to that. So just be cognizant if you're thinking about doing something like this on, you know, that maybe suburban urban waterway, an area that you know gets a lot of paddling pressure. Just be aware of this item here. So again, looking at that to the, you know, experienced or to the moderate paddler, I think if I was in a canoe or a kayak, I'd be fine going up and over the top of that thing. But that's not the case for all experience levels, we'll say. So just know if you are proposing that and you think people may be using that for the waterway for types of recreation, try to address that in your narrative. How can you provide safe passage? Can you put signs upstream, downstream, warn people about upcoming structures, have opportunities for safe portage and things like that? So small dams, right? It is right in the name, beaver dam analog. DNR currently is looking at these structures, whether it's a BDA or a post-assisted log structure as a dam. And then we're going to need to demonstrate and provide some information to help the review. There is very clear language that new hydrologic restoration general permit GB 22 cannot be used to authorize large dams or anything that poses a risk to life, health, or property. So just again, be aware of what the large dam threshold is in state statute. So it can either have a structural height greater than or equal to 25 feet and in pound greater than 15 acre-feet of water, or smaller structural height greater than 6 feet, but in pound a larger area greater than or equal to 50 feet. So that's what kicks you into that large dam category. I think another point of clarification in terms of navigability, DNR does have authority under Chapter 31, you know, to regulate these structures as dams on non-navigable water courses as well. So, you know, a basic differentiation there. If folks have went through the navigability process, working with the DNR Waterways program, a navigable stream needs to have a defined bed and bank and the ability to float a watercraft of the shallowest draft on a recurring basis, I believe is close to the definition. So a water course is similar to that, but kind of peel out the defined bank component. I don't think there's the ability to float, but if you see a defined or an apparent stream bed, that can be an intermittent stream. It could be, you know, a ravine, a dry run, something that only carries event flow. Just because it's not perennial flow, it's not, you know, size enough to float a kayak, just make sure you check with DNR on, you know, do they have authority to regulate the structure as a dam on these water courses? And I shared this graphic here because I think, you know, there's a lot of restoration potential working in headwater settings. You know, and the Briggs site is certainly a first order stream, you know, kind of borderline navigable, but just be aware that, you know, if you're working on one of these non-navigable water courses, the dam regulatory side is still there. Yep, we've seen that photo before. So what kind of information is DNR looking for, you know, to complete their Chapter 31 dam review? From what we've heard, as much information as we can give them, right? But these structures, for a number of the attributes and the points that Brittany made, they don't really fit the mold of traditional Chapter 31, right? So more of a traditional dam figure on the left from DNR website, right? We don't really have defined auxiliary spillways. There's not pipes and orifice and conveyments through the embankment or through the structure. There's no trash rack. There's no weirs and gates and all the lexicon that usually goes along with a dam. So provide what's applicable. And a couple points, again, this is one of those kind of cross-section design figures that Brittany had shared, justify how you came up with your embedded misstep for the post, your spacing, the size. Another piece of information that would be helpful, if you know ordinary high watermark elevations, or you can at least include top of bank elevations in those figures and in your graphics, I think DNR is going to want to see that. So whether that's using, to come up with your crest elevation, your impoundment footprint, using the NRCS engineering tools that Brittany applied for the Briggs site, or some folks at the Wetlands Association said they had actually been using the recently released regional regression equations from USGS and applying some of those peak flow statistics. If you don't have, site-specific discharge or gauging data for your site. I'm not sure, what, if they're looking at like the 50% AEP flood event or something, even smaller or larger than that. So if there are, I see there are a couple WMEs on the line. If you can shine some light on that, or send a follow-up to the group, that would be great. But I believe they were required on that project up in the Marengo to keep the top of those posts a little over a foot below top of bank. And as Brittany mentioned here, right, smaller catchment, lower energy site. We're hopeful that DNR, in the spirit of kind of science and experimentation and low risk, is going to be all right with that proposed design. There is language in that permit that you are required to exceed NRCS technical standards. My read of that is that it does not say Wisconsin specific. So this is just a clip from the NRCS 643 standard. This is actually from the state of Montana. It's my understanding that 640 is in the Wisconsin field office technical guide and available for use. It doesn't look quite like this. There's not specific, technical notes for BDAs or post-assisted log structures. So perhaps this is a resource and approach that folks can use for projects in Wisconsin. We'll see if DNR is accepted of that or not. But again, like Brittany said, these are intended not to be over-engineered. So if you compare this to some of the other NRCS standards, there's another half a page on here that has the operation and maintenance plan, which basically says if part of the structure fails, fix it. It's very light on the technical details. So just know this is out and available for use. If you are not going to meet anything in these standards and you want to propose modifications, those are going to have to get vetted by the local DNR fisheries biologist. So on the, one of the big, I guess, questions, concerns, skeptics around these types of structures is, adverse impacts to fish movement and fish passage, which is a very valid question, concern, and a very hot topic of area of research as well. So I wanted to share just a couple of studies that, again, these are on more, mountainous west streams that may not be totally comparable to the streams we have in the Midwest, nor the type of fish species that we manage in Wisconsin streams. But there was one that focused on mostly natural complexes, looking at 3 species of trout, which is what you're seeing here. And a lot of that is looking at, is there side channel development around these structures? What's the gradient of those? How often is there water in them? And using, pit tags and readers and things like that to try to assess, are fish able to get through these, under these structures, over them? Can they jump over them? Are they going around? So this is one that Wheaton and his colleagues did mostly in the state of Utah. Just a glance at some of the results table, I don't know how many dams are in that left column there. It looks like maybe 24 or so, but only 4 of those after a number of years didn't have any type of side channel development at all. And they are kind of comparable heights to what we may see for beaver dam complexes in the Midwest as well. So I won't go too, I'm not going to do a deep dive into the results. I just wanted to share some of the ongoing research that's out there. I'll leave it to you if you want to look into that further. The second one, so this is a beaver dam analog complex. This is one that's looking at salmon. So again, right, a more aggressive species, maybe not as comparable to Wisconsin, unless you're talking about Superior Lake Michigan tributaries, but a similar approach. So just some of the results from that first study, natural complexes, right? Looking at brook and brown trout species that we have in Wisconsin streams. You can see that about half of those dams were passed by a number of fish. A bit more movement in the downstream direction versus the upstream direction, not a huge surprise. The line graph over to the right there just shows both brook and brown trout. They passed a number of those dams, but for some reason that really seemed to start to die off after that. So whether that's attributed to the passage wasn't adequate, the fish got tired, maybe they were able to move up, down far enough to reach their spawning grounds or wherever they're trying to go. But they're kind of, the point is they're not serving as a 100% impassable barrier, but they may be serving as a barrier, right? So more research needed. Similar design for the BDA complex, right? So they actually constructed side channels with this, and they put pit tags and fish and readers and sensors and antennas at a bunch of different locations, again, to try to determine how are those fish moving past, around, through, up, over those types of barriers. And just one of the figures from the results there, again, I will, clarify, this is primarily looking at coho salmon. So, a complex jump height of 27 to 40 centimeters may not be much for a species like that, but a young of the year brook trout in Wisconsin, right? That may be quite an effort. So, but it did show that after fish were released in the downstream pools, a good majority of those fish were moving out of there after just a number of days. So a more Wisconsin specific example, again, this is just from some of my very recent fishing outings. This is kind of one of the lower sections of Mount Vernon Creek, the stream in kind of southern Dane County at the very downstream end of the DNR fishery area. Folks are familiar with that. So this is Google Earth from 2022. Really no beaver in there at all. Fast forward to 2024. You can see that structure showed up there, and notice immediately to the north of there, kind of those two wide channels, and to the south, where there is inundation and water definitely moving around the sides of those structures. So this is standing immediately below the structure. Again, note on the right and left-hand side, it's starting to kind of scour and flank around there, and there is a good amount of flow coming through the structure itself. From this photo, looking off to the right, to the north, you can see there's, side channels that have started to develop on top of that pool, and it's not very apparent. And I didn't do a very good photo shoot here because it was getting dark, but there are down gradient side channels that are starting to form after just a year, where, a year later, after that scours it a little bit more, maybe a means for a fish to make its way around that. And the side channels, these aren't just like a couple inches of water. If I was a trout, I mean, that's something I was considering throwing a fly in myself. It's a foot and a half, 2 feet of water, 2 feet of depth. So, if I was a fish, that looks like it may be welcoming and safe passage. And again, another area where that downstream side channel development is continuing to form. One other item to think about, maybe not in the regulatory context, again, but just there are some concerns about, right, if you're putting a lot of these structures, slowing the flow, inducing ponding, sediment is dropping out, you're going to cover up a lot of this nice coarse substrate that is important for, right, the base of the food web for the fishery, for macroinvertebrates. So this is another area that the research, at least my literature review, the research is a little light, but people are starting to look at this more. And there's, a couple different arguments. There is, in middle, if you're looking at this very locally behind a single structure, there may be loss of some of that core substrate. But if you look at it as a reach overall, what are you trying to do? We want to keep a check on downstream scour, like Brittany said, but you are going to induce scour. Some of these are intended to induce scour on the outsides of banks. So you are, kind of accentuating the natural pool, glide, riffle, run sequence in these streams from something that may be, a long sedimented in run anyways, and you reestablish more of this kind of natural progression that we see in streams. So I think there's a couple different ways of looking at it. The important part is something to be thinking about when you're considering these types of practices. Some of the tools and resources, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. So this is a figure that you saw from Faith this morning. This is one of those kind of stream evolution models, the stream functional pyramid. There's a number of states out there that have kind of these state-specific stream quantification tools that, you know, EPA and Army Corps and DNR are using for regulatory purposes. And there's also a lot of really good non-regulatory applications of these. But for the stream tool, I think it's really important, and Faith did mention this, they really are designed and intended more for single thread channels. There are a lot of people asking about, or asking for SQTs that can be used for more anastomatosing, stream wetland, beaver complex type settings. So the design consultant that EPA retains for a lot of the work on these state-specific tools is definitely working on that and looking into it, but just wanted to make a note of clarification there. So really how these tools work, if you're not familiar, there's really 5 functional categories that line up with the 5 levels of the stream functional pyramid. There's a number of individual metrics within each of those functional categories. And it has roll-up scoring, and it'll actually give you a score for each of the functional categories. Either you're functioning at risk, partial function, or considered, in terms of a reference site to not be functioning at all. And it really is a delta tool, right? You put in an existing condition, a proposed condition like you see in the bottom right, and it's a delta tool to measure the degree of change or environmental lift from a project. So, I was involved somewhat in the development of the Wisconsin tool, and they really tried to do a deep dive and use any Wisconsin specific data sets or something that may be, from an applicable ecological landscape in Minnesota or Wisconsin or Illinois. Like for this reference curve for E-streams for entrenchment ratio, that's something that a lot of those reference came from some of the Roskin criteria. So I know there's both skeptics and critics about using the Roskin approach in Wisconsin. So I will let you decide if that's a tool that's right for you or not. Similarly, if folks are familiar with the Wisconsin rapid assessment methodology for wetlands, the thing that DNR uses again for their regulatory program, they partnered with the 3 state agencies in Minnesota and are working on developing a similar tool to that stream quantification tool to update that rapid assessment methodology that can be used both in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I should mention there was a recent switch. Minnesota had one of those SQTs, Wisconsin had one. At the end of the day, we realized, well, there's a lot of similarities in the resources and the reference curves. So they're actually working to merge that tool to make it a little bit easier on folks that work throughout the region in both those states. One other one that folks might be familiar with, the Wetlands by Design tool. This is a Nature Conservancy project with partnership from Wisconsin DNR and some other folks. But basically, a really easy online mapping application to give you an idea of potentially restorable wetlands and what the different ratings of current wetlands on the landscape are, so you can get a good idea of habitat nexus and adjacency and things like that. So if you're not familiar with that, I would encourage you to check that out. FEMA floodplain, I'm already a little bit over time here. I didn't want to do a deep dive into this. This could be an 8-hour webinar in and of itself. But just know if you're working in any regulated floodplain, that this HECRAS or the H&H modeling may come along with that. So, one of the benefits we're trying to tout about this is low cost, right? As you start to get into floodplain modeling, that can quickly get you out of the low cost category. So regardless of if you're in a studied floodway, a zone A, a studied zone E, requirements for any of these types of water course alterations, whether it's just impounding water, and kind of an indirect change of the channel, any water course alteration, you may be subject to having to go through the map revision process with FEMA. So the big point here is early on, if you're in or even close to a floodplain boundary like we are at Briggs, just contact your county zoning administrator and talk to the local DNR water management specialist early. So the last slide, right, this is all building up to, you know, help DNR make your life easier and help make their life easier, right? How do you build a strong narrative for these projects to include with, you know, a future GP22 application or for any type of permits you're applying for? You know, start with historic conditions, spend a lot of time on your impairment assessment, really make sure you have strong justification for that and you have that dialed in. What is your restoration potential, right? If you're trying to, you know, improve fish passage or, you know, improves trout habitat on a stream and a quarter mile upstream, you have a 2-foot perch culvert. Well, that may be a little bit limiting to achieve your goals. So just be realistic about that. Go through your design alternatives. You know, a lot of folks are kind of questioning here, like, why aren't we going to try to rechannelize the stream? Why aren't we going stage 0 and trying to restore it to, you know, true hydrologic reference condition? That's because there are other variables as far as, you know, wants of the landowner, folks that are doing the management, protecting the vegetation communities. So, you know, that stream tool, you go through that, you put your reference stream type, you put your design stream type, you put your proposed stream type, right? And those aren't always going to match up perfectly because there's always some of these competing variables like we have on this site. So just be realistic about that. And the predicted outcomes piece, you know, we've talked about, I think you could probably put a little green rectangle around every one of these. Yes, I think we're going to probably, you're going to capture some sediment that's going to have some phosphorus on it, that's going to have water quality improvements. But really focus in on like, what are the big goals of the project? And like Mike and Brittany and folks have been talking about, it really is to try to increase groundwater infiltration, help with base flow maintenance on that receiving stream in each branch of Raccoon Creek, both in terms of water quality and in terms of temperature. So as we put together the narrative for this project, those are the ones that we're going to focus on here. And anything you can do to include quantifiable benefits, that could be the stream tool, it can be different resources, whatever it is, that goes a long way. And, you know, make sure that you're addressing the full gamut of public trust assurances, right? There's more than just the environmental and the natural resource factors in the rules that DNR administers in that program. So that is all I had. And I think I made it, 12:31. So we were close, Kelly.
Well, James, before you stop sharing your screen, could you throw up the slide you had with the links to the permit applications again? Someone had asked to see that again. We are cutting it close to time, and just to be mindful of everyone, I know there's a lot to talk about with this topic. Marty, you had raised your hand a little bit ago, so I will go ahead and press the button that lets you unmute yourself if you have something real quick that we can address here.
It was an accidental push. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. All right. I know there are still a few more questions, I think, lingering out in the chat that maybe didn't get answered by anyone in the chat. I know a lot of people were chiming in to help out. I will send out everyone's contact information in the follow-up email so that you have those resources. You can reach out to our panelists. I'm sure if you have any additional questions. I want to take the time. We all want to thank all of you for joining today's webinar, and the sponsors once again who have helped and continue to help with these efforts. And thank you to our panelists for your time and your presentations today. One last reminder that this webinar was recorded today, and the recording will be available online in the very near future. So you will receive an email in the coming days with the link to that recording, any other materials that today's presenters wish to share out. We had a few things that were mentioned during the presentations today, so we'll include links to those as well, and an evaluation for this webinar, which kind of helps us better understand your interests and your needs in conservation trainings. So with that, have a great rest of your day, and thanks again. All have a good Thursday afternoon.